Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Okay, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb, speak of a topic that's not talked about a lot, quite sublime teaching, Paticca Samuppada. I might be doing this talk, I think, as much for myself as for anybody else, because I've had some ideas around this teaching of the Buddha for, many years that kind of changed over the years, and there's a new way of looking at it in my own internal way that I've already used this opportunity to kind of force myself to face some kind of holes in that perspective and try to figure it out. So I've often found over the years that speaking about something, things will just spontaneously arise, and maybe I'll get lucky and figure something out on the way. But before I do that, it's a teaching that's, the Buddha kind of admonishes Ananda. Ananda says in the Mahanidana Sutta, the Greater Discourse on Origination, how wonderful the Paticca Samuppada is and how sublime and great it is, and how he sees it clearly. And the Buddha says, don't say that. It's quite deep and profound. And so I think part of that is like you'll see in modern thinking, especially commentarial, the idea of very precise definitions of very precise interpretations of what the Buddha says. But there's a sutta called the Majjhima Sutta, in which there's 6 bhikkhus who are referring to a teaching of the Buddha that's in the Pariyavagga, which is part of the Sutta Nipata. And in that, so it's kind of a discussion of 6 bhikkhus trying to figure out an interpretation of the Buddha's teaching, and they basically come to the point hey, why don't we just go ask the Buddha? So they go ask the Buddha, and the Buddha says, all 6 of your interpretations are valid. And at the time I was thinking the first interpretation, I'm not going to go into the subtleties of that teaching, is there's 6 basically pretty significant contemplations one can use with that. It's a question and answers with a Brahmin, which he responds in verse, and it's kind of cryptic, and all 6 of them I think can be used as deep contemplations. And Paticca Samuppada is the same way, and I think many of the Buddha's teachings are the same way. They're structured in a way that gives you some basis for orienting around a contemplation. And so I think Paticca Samuppada really is that. It's a way of contemplating experience, relating to experience, and trying to lead one to the state of cessation of fabrication of suffering. So first of all, probably for people who don't know, I'll go through what dependent origination is in brief. Classically, it's thought of as the 12 steps, but in reality, the Buddha says dependent origination is a formula. That is, this being that is, with the arising of this arises. This not being, this is not, with the cessation of that ceases. And then he uses the phrase yadidang, which means for example, more or less. And then he'll go into the 12 steps, which he in another sutta calls dependently arisen things. And that's really what most people consider dependent origination, which I think is somewhat of an error, but that's what I'm actually going to be talking mostly is about those 12 steps. And those 12 steps are, with ignorance, there is sankharas, formations. With formations, we have consciousness. Because of consciousness, we have name and form. Because of name and form, there is the sense base. The sense base gives rise to contact. Contact gives rise to feeling. Feeling gives rise to craving. Craving gives rise to clinging or grasping. Grasping gives rise to becoming. Becoming gives rise to birth. Birth gives rise to death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And then the Buddha will go through the negation of that, which is with remainderless fading away of ignorance, the fading away of sankharas, formations, the fading of formations, the cessation of consciousness. With the cessation of consciousness is the cessation of name and form. With the cessation of name and form is the cessation of the sense base. With the cessation of the sense base is the cessation of contact. With the cessation of contact, there's the cessation of feeling. With the cessation of feeling, there's the cessation of craving. With the cessation of craving, there's the cessation of grasping. With the cessation of grasping, there's the cessation of becoming. With the cessation of becoming, there's the cessation of birth. And with the cessation of birth, there's the cessation of death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. So, that's a lot. That's a lot to unpack. And I need to briefly probably go through also the two classic interpretations. There's the commentarial interpretation, and then let's say that would be, that's what you'll find often in like Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations. The stuff that will be in the back will be related to the Three Life interpretation. I think maybe he's backed off of that somewhat. And for many years after, I first started off reading the Majjhima Nikaya before I, really had much practice, and I kind of formulated my own kind of take on it, that this was somehow a process. And for many years I thought I'd listen to this Three Life interpretation and I'd be like, are these people crazy? And there is actually a reason why I pretty much think the Three Life interpretation should be fairly dismissed. The Dhamma is described as that which can be characterized as the Dhamma is sanditiko, akaliko, ehipasiko, opaneko, pachatang, veditabo, vinyui, which is a part of our opening chanting. It's a standard phrase for kind of a test of what is the Dhamma. And the Dhamma is apparent here and now, timeless, encouraging investigation, leading inwards to be experienced by the wise. Now, the idea, and Paticca is something that supposedly that is stated that someone who enters stream entry has directly seen dependent origination. And it's quite clear that three lives is not apparent here and now. It's not timeless. It's very much in the field of time. And to be experienced by the wise, there are many arahants who never develop or cultivate the capability of seeing their past lives. And nowhere in the Suttas of the Buddha ever, as far as I'm aware, talk about anything about seeing a future. So I think the Three Life view, as some other people have kind of just put it to the side. The other view, which can be very sticky, but has its own problems as well, is this kind of moment-to-moment interpretation. And the reason why I think this can be quite sticky is because you can very easily see something like in your own experience, like have a feeling, a pleasant feeling or a aversive feeling, and see the craving that is associated with it. There's a very typical area. And then there can be this idea that, oh gee, well maybe if my mind is subtle enough, I'll see all 12 of these steps. But if you investigate it and I've been doing it for quite, almost 20 years, you'll find that there's some real problems with the idea of the moment-to-moment interpretation. There's some sequential problems. You have sankharas giving rise to consciousness. Consciousness gives rise to name and form, and the name and form giving rise to the sense base. And it's quite clear in many, many suttas, especially in the suttas around the sense base, that consciousness arises independent of a sense base. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, tongue consciousness, all mind consciousness, all 6 consciousnesses are independent of the sense base. So the idea that the sense base is dependent on consciousness contradicts that. Another kind of sequential problem is name and form. If you analyze that, that's composed of feeling, intention, perception, contact, perception, and attention, manasikara. So that's before feeling and contact. And so how can you have something that is based on feeling and contact when feeling and contact supposedly doesn't arise later on? So that's another sequential problem. There's also always the kind of metaphorical problem of having birth before death. People often explain this away that are proponents of the moment-to-moment view by like, oh, well, that's kind of birth into some kind of experience. Like, I've been born into anger. I've been born into some kind of descriptive self. But the Buddha actually says birth is what we consider birth. He describes it as being, a mother and a father come together in union, and he's got some description around that of the metaphysics of it. And 9 to 10 months later, there is birth. And so he's clearly talking about what is conventionally known as birth. So that presents a problem to the moment-to-moment view. Now, there's a poem, a simile, a series of similes that I find very, very intriguing in this area. That I'll just give you the English for it. Form is like a lump of foam. Feeling is like an airy bubble. Perceptions are just a mirage. Sankharas are a plantain tree. Consciousness is a magician's trick. So are these similes made known by the kinsman of the sun, which is a epithet for the Buddha. So this is, and the Buddha uses this in various places in verse, these similes. Part of that cognitive idea that this is a process-oriented thing, I think, is comes from an a priori kind of structure of the Western mind that sees everything like kind of technologically and process-oriented. I don't really think that existed in the time of the Buddha to the state that it does today. And that simile of the sankhara is like a plantain tree, I think is quite important. And this is the very front end of Paticca Samuppada, has this ignorance gives rise to sankharas. Now, what does that simile say? What is a plantain tree? I had to investigate this. And a plantain tree is like a banana tree. And basically that kind of tree doesn't have any heartwood, doesn't have any pith, any center. It's just layers built upon layers. If you start peeling layers off, you'll just keep peeling the bark, and all of a sudden it'll all be gone. And that's what a sankhara is a construct. It's something that's put together. And the ignorance that underlies that is the ignorance towards this process. And it can fundamentally be said the ignorance of impermanence and not self. So we see things as being permanent and essential when in fact they're not. They're fabricated. So a better way, and that is implicit in that dependent origination structure, but I have found that it's better to be actually very explicit with myself. And I'll go through an explicit presentation of that to kind of drive that home. So you have ignorance gives rise to sankharas. And sankharas give rise to consciousness. Now, what is consciousness then? It is a fabrication rooted in ignorance. And what is name and form? It is a fabrication rooted in ignorance. What are the sense bases? They're fabrications rooted in ignorance. What is contact? It's a fabrication rooted in ignorance. What is a feeling? Fabrication rooted in ignorance. What is craving? Fabrication rooted in ignorance. Craving, fabrication rooted in ignorance. Grasping, fabrication rooted in ignorance. Becoming, fabrication rooted in ignorance. Birth, fabrication rooted in ignorance. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, they're all fabrications that are rooted in ignorance. Nowhere along the line Is there any essential nature to any of it? They're all, and this is the way I really relate to Paticcasamuppada now, is more as a hierarchy of cognitive concepts that are built upon on top of each other. In the Mahanidana Sutta, it's kind of a curious statement after the Ananda makes this. The Buddha throws out a bunch of, I would say, very, they're not typical Buddha-type statements. They're very like, he says, suppose there was no birth of any beings anywhere in the world. No devas were born anywhere in the world. No, he goes to the yakas, he goes to humans, through, all the different realms of beings. He says, suppose none of them were born, would there be any death? And I'm not sure, like, if it's a translation thing or, because he goes through this several times in the sutta. I really see that as more like, suppose the concept of birth wasn't there. You wouldn't have death. I mean, in order to conceive that I am going to die someday, it's a necessary cognitive concept that I was born. It's something that we take very much for granted. But just think about that. You can't, if there was no idea that you were ever born, if you were eternal, if you had always been, you could never go back and find a place where you hadn't been, you would never conceive that, okay, someday I'm going to stop being. But somewhere along the line when we're 3 or 4, we start off with this like, oh, I'm 4. How old are you? I'm 4. I'm 5. It probably doesn't really mean much to us as kids. Oh, I'm 5 years old. But we get a little brother or a little sister, or we have a cousin or uncle that gets born. And then there's this idea that, hey, there was not a being, and then there was a being. And so that this idea of birth is something that becomes cognitively imprinted upon us, this idea of like, oh, this thing came into being. And this, what is the fundamental cognitive structure that has to be in place in order for you to have the idea of birth? And that is the concept that things become. If you don't have the cognitive concept that things can become, you can't have the concept of birth. And birth is actually just a very specialized version of becoming. You can say like a car becomes, they made a car. But that's still a concept, but we really highly associate with this idea of birth. But cognitively, the idea that something becomes is a necessary prerequisite for the idea of cognitively have the idea that I was born. Now, what is the cognitive structure that has to be necessary in order to have the idea that something becomes? And I would say that is a little more difficult one, but that is the idea that things are, can be. And this is built upon grasping that something is. This is the Upadana section of the Paticcasamuppada. It's a very difficult section, but it's quite important. And the most often related to Upadana in the teachings of the Buddha, the Panchupadana Khandha, the 5 objects of grasping of self. So you have the grasping as form as self, the grasping as feeling as self, the grasping of perceptions as self, the grasping of sankharas, all these formations as self, and the grasping of consciousness as self. Now, if you really look at it, and you're really honest with yourself, and it probably takes a good bit of practice on the cushion as well, some people might not admit this in the world, never in your experience is any of those things ever the same. Let alone, like, it's constantly changing. But you can get to a point in your practice where you can say, I have never, ever, ever experienced the same feeling twice. I've never had the same perception twice. I've never had the same fabrication thought twice. I've never had the same body my whole life. I started off as, before I can even think. And I remember, when I first got a little puppy, that's one of my first memories. And you can walk around like 3 or 4 years old. But nowhere along that time, until the day I die and you die, you're never going to have the same body the whole time. And consciousness, of course, it's It's never one time been the same. But we try, the grasping of things is trying to categorize things into something that's takes that chaos and makes it into something. So it's looking for patterns. And this takes us all the way down. This basically is the process that gets us all the way down to consciousness. And so it can be quite elaborate. In some places it can be quite subtle. But so what's the necessary construct in order to have that grasping? This one's also quite difficult. And I think this is where it starts to become more personal. The other stuff is can be spoken of more generally. But tanha, craving, that is why the things that are in your world that you grasp are particular to you. And for me, it's kind of hard to see this in a direct related way, like how that structure is necessary, other than the fact that I know that there's a ton of things in the world that I don't really have any idea what they are. But to you, they might be very important, like your hobbies or your careers. There's all kinds of things in your world that I don't even know exist. But why do the things in my world and the things in your world exist is because they're particular to what you want, desire, or is important to your life. And that's central to craving. Now, what's the necessary cognitive structure in order to have craving? You have to have a feeling about it. You have to either think it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. If there is no differentiation in the feeling experience, then there would be no hierarchy of discerning, liking something over another thing. So in order to have craving, you have to have a feeling about it. And so that is the necessary kind of cognitive experience and structure that is necessary in order to develop craving for things. Contact. Contact is probably one of the trickiest ones, and one I'm have the most difficult with. And it's actually quite curious that contact is one. When you study the sense bases and when you consider the sense bases, it's actually a cognitive construct that requires three things to occur. It has to be the internal sense base, the external sense base, and consciousness. And the Buddha says the bringing together of these three things is contact. And this seems to be also the kind of bifurcation of experience. It's the fabrication that I am experiencing something external to the world. It can be internal. It can be like my pain in my knee. But really, when this is kind of like, I think we can relate to this. I have found I kind of relate to this in the kind of, like this comes up philosophically in the past. Like there's the idea of the brain. How do we know we're not a brain in a vat? Or how do we know we aren't a part of some delusion that some demon has created? We have this underlying idea that we know we're creating this. The idea that The Matrix, that movie, can resonate with so many people is because we kind of know that the sense base, the idea that these things out there could be a trick, and that we're fabricating the internal and external world. It resonates in our experience. And so this contact is a part of that process of like fabricating it's a manifestation of that dynamic of the internal and external world become manifest. And it's necessary that we actually still have this idea of the sense bases, like that this is, I'm seeing this, I'm hearing this, these different layers. And it's related also into the fact that this is what the mind is a part of bringing this together. The mind is the sense base that weaves the other sense bases together. It's the one that can partake of the other sense bases. And so the mind is quite central to this very subtle fabrication that ties, like say, this auditory sound of me flicking the glass with the actual visual of seeing it and the tactile of touching it. All of these sensory experiences come together in the idea that, okay, well, there's something out there in the world. And that's something that is really quite deep. That's why it's quite a hard, and that's why achieving liberation is quite a feat, because it comes in overcoming this pervasive fabrication. Now, consciousness, name, and form. These two they're codependently arisen in a separate sutta. Sariputta talks about them, and he gives the simile, which is of two bundles of reeds. Consciousness and name and form are like two bundles of reeds. And again, the Arahants and the Buddha are so brilliant with their similes. Think about two bundles of reeds. Here again, we have two things that are, a bundle of reed is something that's put together. It's individual reeds that we put together. And the reeds themselves are actually hollow straws, like a reed, a blade of grass, a piece of small bamboo doesn't even have a center. It's hollow. And so consciousness, that's why the simile of consciousness is like a magic trick. This idea that like these things, the vijnana, this divided knowing, it's just a field, it's like a screen, all the pixels on a screen. And why does this one set of pixels become separated out in the mind? It becomes separated out because there's something about it evokes some kind of purpose or response, a feeling response. So there's a sutta where the Buddha says all objects converge on feeling. And name and form, one of the constituent components is feeling. So those objects in your world, they become objects because they do something for you. There are plenty of things out there in the forest, like that you don't even know what they are, unless, like, let's say you're an arborist, or you're into trees, or you're into animals. And, okay, it's some kind of mammal. I don't know. But somebody who's really into it, they know all the subtlety. They have a name for it. Oh, that's a marmot. That's a weasel, or some kind of special otter. No, you can tell by this. There's some kind of bird with this kind of feathers. It's that kind of bird. For me, it's just a bird. And that name and form is particular to them because it means something to them, and it has some kind of evocative power. Things in our lives that we are conscious of, it's because it does something for us. And so this is how, from our childhood, those things that we delight and indulge in are those things that have developed some kind of feeling for. So this is the layers of fabrication, the hierarchies of construct that we use to fabricate the world and suffering. People actually fabricate their suffering. When you don't suffer a lot, you see that all the time. You see people making absolutely nothing into suffering. Now, to them, it doesn't appear that way. And that's like one of my favorite teachers, Katakurunda Nyanananda. He has a story, which I won't go into the depth of the story, that, it says dependent origination. That's one way that can be seen is like your world is dependent upon what you make out of it. And you can stop making that if you don't want. You don't have to make it. It's a choice you make. But, like one of our evening chanting, I think it is, in the Baigir we do, or we have this is saying, bound by dukkha and obstructed by dukkha. When you're in the midst of it, you can't see it. And this is how I've seen Paticca Samuppada can be used as a tool for practice. And that's really what is all that's really important, is how can this be used as a tool for practice. If you think that moment-to-moment methodology is going to work for you, I found that to be a basket of dukkha in and of itself. I don't think you're ever going to get your mind. In fact, neurologically speaking, there are studies that I've seen that shows that cognitively we batch process experience, and it kind of maps onto our neural net in tenth of a second increments. So you're never going to get to the subtlety that the commentaries say you're going to get to. Modern science basically rules that out. And the experience doesn't really seem to accord with that either. And I kind of realized this was external to me. I was at the Pacific Hermitage, and this woman had this question. She goes, I've noticed becoming a lot. What do I do about that? And it kind of struck me. And so it really kind of solidified this idea of dwelling. The idea that we dwell in experience, certain layers of experience. The Buddha uses the word vihara, which is the same word for like dwelling in the monastery. This is our, like we would say that in the monastic terminology in Pali, that this is the vihara. This is where our dwelling is. But he uses that same terminology for the jhanas. He uses that same terminology for lots of meditative states, dwellings. And so my answer to her was like, get better at recognizing it. So you're in a state of mind where you recognize whatever you consider becoming. Now it's hard for me to even know specifically what she is saying, because that can mean different things to different people. Like I'm becoming angry, or having a sense of my like sense of self, like my like desire to be liked or wanted. These kind of things can be very, just whatever it is, get better at recognizing it. And what Paticca Samuppada is showing is that when you dial in to one of these layers of fabrication, over time, the mind will settle to the point where you can see the causes that give rise to that fabrication. And so, that goes back to the original. This being this is, with the arising of this arises. So let's say you're in that field of, let's say, I'm seeing craving, or I'm seeing, let's say better even feeling. Feeling's a very common one. It's very good to go straight to feeling because it cuts out a lot of other stuff. That's why Goenka methodology is quite a useful methodology, is because it kind of cuts out the mind. So let's say you get yourself to in abiding in feeling quite strongly, quite persistent. You'll see how that feeling changes in dependence on contact with specific sensory experiences. And then you start to become dispassionate to any idea that you're controlling that feeling. That feeling only arose because I saw that sight. I didn't make that feeling arise. I saw something that I considered attractive, or I considered desirous, or I considered beautiful, and the pleasant feelings arose. And then that contact with that sight went away, and the feeling went away. And then you get better at seeing contact. You'll get better at seeing how you fabricate those objects. And so it's a practice that relates to other practice of meditation, where you dial into a dwelling of a certain layer of experience, and you get better and better at seeing the subtlety. I think this is also particular to, like, if you consider the jhanas. Jhanas also kind of fall under this. We kind of have this idea, according to some schools, that jhana is like this kind of complete cessation of experience. Like you're off in this like secluded black abyss void where only there's kind of mental objects, nimittas, and the whole world is cut off. And I'm quite convinced now that there are much more dwelling experiences of dwelling of states of mind. And I started seeing that with, like, if you look at the particular description of the third jhana, the third jhana has a quote in it that says the person experiencing jhana is still experiencing pleasure and pain with equanimity, but on account of which the noble ones say, what is it, the exact words? He has a pleasant abiding and is equanimous and mindful. So this is like other people are saying this about you. It's like instead of like saying he's an angry person all the time. People can dwell in their anger. They can dwell in their delusions. They can dwell in like being famous. As a meditative practitioner, you dwell in these states. You can dwell in experiencing your feelings fairly contiguously. You'll bounce up and down, but generally you'll find over the time you stay in these kind of ranges. And this Paticca Samuppada helps you categorize those fabrications and helps you point it to find where you can make them, what is the cause of those, and get subtler and subtler. So that I think is enough for my exposition on Paticca Samuppada. And hopefully you can find something in here to find useful.
Namayam Dhamma Kathaya Sadhu Param Dharamase Sadhu